Hello everyone and welcome to Module 6. In Module 6 we'll discuss ethics. Your book does a really nice job of covering the history and some of the basic principles of ethics that guide our research and our practice today. The Mustanski article also gives you a little bit of a case study of how we might think about applying some of those concepts to working with LGBT adolescents. So we'll cover some of those concepts in today's lecture, but this lecture is really meant to extend the information that is in the chapter. So I won't belabor a lot of the points that they make and review the material in there, but I'll extend and expand upon that material. So as discussed in both the readings, there are three basic ethical principles that have come out of basically a lot of screwing up in the past. We want to maintain respect for persons. Beneficence and non-maleficence are usually put together, so minimizing possible harms and maximizing benefits. And the third principle is justice, so making sure we're distributing benefits and risks of research fairly. And so that includes not selecting people based on convenience or because they're vulnerable to manipulation. And we'll talk a little bit about how those apply specifically to sex research. Your book does a great job of talking about them overall, and so I think it's important and relevant here to think about the applications of these specifically to sexuality research. So in thinking about autonomy, obviously much like all other research, obtaining informed consent based on complete research information is critical. Some sexuality researchers have talked about balancing this need for informed consent to give people complete information with the need to obtain sexual information from those who might not necessarily volunteer to participate in sex research. As we'll talk about when we talk about sampling, we know that there are certain kinds of people who participate in sexuality research. They tend to be more sexually experienced, higher in sensation seeking, perhaps more liberal in their sexual and relational attitudes. And so one of the things that we do in giving people complete consent, complete information about what that study is potentially weed out people who might not want to tell us about their sexual behavior, which is great from the perspective of autonomy, allowing people to make that decision for themselves. And on the other hand, it makes it so that our research may not give us a complete sense of the world, particularly those who may be more conservative in their behaviors or attitudes. We also want to make careful decisions about reporting potential harm, and I'll talk more about this in this module as well, but thinking about if we want to break confidentiality and report instances of interpersonal violence or sexual assault or potential suicidality. So there are a lot of really intense things that can come up in the course of sex research, and we may want to think about making really careful decisions about when we would want to break confidentiality and to some degree remove somebody's autonomy and report that for them in a situation where they may not have reported that themselves. Certainly being non-judgmental about people's life choices and beliefs helps us to maintain their autonomy. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well. And obviously maintaining privacy and confidentiality or anonymity if that's the direction we're going in our research. To preserve justice, I talked in the first slide about moving beyond convenience samples, so not selecting people purely based on convenience, which a lot of sexuality researchers do because we are positioned at university campuses where undergraduate students often need to participate in research. They are definitely a captive audience for us. So moving beyond college student samples is important when the research dictates that that would be appropriate. And sometimes this requires research in populations that present ethical dilemmas. So the Mustanski article talks about the need for research with LGBT adolescents because of health disparities and the potential dilemmas, ethical dilemmas that creates for us in conducting research with adolescents, with LGBT adolescents in particular. Another piece of this is thinking about applying research to practice so that the benefits of that research, assuming that we are translating that to a practice that will improve people's lives, is distributed equally so that those benefits will not just benefit a certain group of people or a minimal group of people, but really thinking about distributing the benefits of that research equally across a variety of populations. And beneficence and non-maleficence, again, we want to guard against loss of privacy or breaches of confidentiality. Those could have potential harm in people's lives if, for example, it's exposed that they're engaged in stigmatized sexual practices, substance use, things like that. And I think it's really important, and the Mustancy article touches on this a little bit, to think about the role of distress or negative emotions and the distinction between negative emotions or distress and actual harm. So is asking people to answer questions that may make them feel somewhat negatively, particularly if you're asking about childhood sexual assault or something that is unpleasant for a lot of people to think about. Is that unpleasant emotion the same as creating harm in somebody's lives? And as the Mustanski article talks about, the benchmark that we often use is the distress or the harm that we're creating in asking people to participate in this research more than that they would encounter in daily life, in engaging in doctor's visits, sort of their day-to-day life. And so we have to think about what kind of harm or potential harm or distress or negative emotions that we're talking about and how different or similar those might be to what people encounter in their day-to-day lives. Again, we want to be non-judgmental about people's lives and choices and their beliefs. This is a big piece of beneficence and non-maleficence as well as autonomy. And I think it's important as we think about all of these issues to remember that as both researchers and practitioners, we may be faced with ethical dilemmas in which the solution is not always a black and white solution. I think people think, all right, we have this set of ethical guidelines and I can look at these and the right answer will be obvious. And often as researchers, we're in situations where we're really trying to balance a lot of competing sort of pressures and demands. And so these are often not black and white decisions that we're making, but really complex issues that may present us with ethical dilemmas that we need to figure out. And we should be consistently examining our practices to ensure that we meet and potentially go beyond the basic ethical requirements. So a lot of what we talk about are sort of these basic minimum requirements, and we can think about whether those minimum requirements are the place where we start and where we might go beyond that, and how going beyond that may be an even better way to go about our research. So I'm thinking about potential benefits and harms in sex research. I think the Mustanski article does a nice job of talking about how, maybe we think sex research is maybe IRBs, probably not we, but maybe IRBs and other folks think sex research is potentially more harmful than it actually is in people's lives. And increasingly, there is more and more research demonstrating that this is actually not the case, which is fantastic for researchers who can now take this literature back to their institutional review boards and use its information to make decisions as they move forward in their own research. So there's an article that came out that a lot of people have used. This is a survey of 800 and something Dutch adolescents and young adults, so 15 to 25-year-olds, asking them a bunch of questions about their sexual behavior, sexual attitudes, and sexuality. And what they found is that people reported very little distress. 25% reported feeling somewhat down or sad afterwards. Very few experienced a need for help. And overwhelmingly, the participants reported feeling positive feelings due to their participation. And importantly, distress and positive feelings weren't mutually exclusive. So people could say that they felt down or sad, and also that they also felt positive feelings, that they felt like the research was important, that they felt like they contributed, they felt like they learned something about themselves. There were some demographic and experiential differences in people's experience of participating in sex research. So there was a small difference between those who'd experienced sexual violence in that they reported more distress, but interestingly also more positive feelings than those without a history of sexual violence. So again, not mutually exclusive. Those from a non-Western background experience more distress than youth from Western backgrounds. So again, it's important to think about the cultural context in these situations. Women experience somewhat more distress than men, but there were no differences in distress or positive feelings according to sexual risk behavior. So those who engaged in sexual risk versus those who didn't. There's some concern sometimes with IRBs asking people to admit to engaging in sexual risk behavior, which may be very stigmatized, may make them feel guilty, may actually be very bad for them in terms of potentially causing psychological harm. And so other researchers have talked about the potential harm of asking or not asking about sexual experiences, particularly sexual trauma experiences, childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, for example. So when we think of sex research, we often think of just tell me about your sexual behavior or whatever, but we're also often asking very intense questions about trauma and abuse. And so one of the big picture things that may stem from not asking, a lot of people will say, I don't know if I can deal with that ethically. I don't know how to ask it appropriately. I don't have the resources to be able to handle it if people do indicate that they have had those experiences. And so I'm just not going to ask. And actually, not asking may lead to the development of inappropriate treatments that may have the potential for re-traumatizing people who have experienced some sort of sexuality-related trauma. So asking people is actually incredibly important to make sure that we are taking that into account when we're developing education and therapeutic practices. And there has been some research indicating that questions about trauma or abuse are less likely than other kinds of daily experiences to trigger recall. So in this particular study, what the researcher found is that actually most people experienced a trigger of these a recall of these experiences via the media or engaging in sexual experiences. So questions in the research realm were less likely than sort of daily experiences to trigger that recall. And another piece of this is that participants are also capable of declining research when they believe that it may be upsetting to them. And what we know is that if we tell people what the research is going to be about, they may say, and there's been research to support this, they may say, I'm not going to participate because I don't want to think about that. I don't feel like I can handle it. I don't want to think about it. I'm not going to engage in this research. I'm going to decline. And so being able to allow them the autonomy to make that decision is also really important, particularly if we think about not wanting to engage in similar patterns of denying them autonomy as the abuse or violence did potentially in the first place. And so an example that a lot of people talk about within sexuality research is probably one that you have heard about. Many of you probably have heard of the tea room trade study. This is Laud Humphreys. This was actually his dissertation research. He was at Washington University in St. Louis, and this was his dissertation research. He published it as a book in 1970. And he essentially served as what was called a watch queen for roughly 100 men who were engaged in anonymous public sex in like rest stop bathrooms, essentially. And so he would go and offer to watch out for them and make sure nobody was coming, and he would also watch them engage in sexual behaviors. And then he recorded license plate numbers and later obtained home addresses for these men and names from police registers by posing as a market researcher. He later showed up at their homes to interview them for a health survey, not telling them, obviously, that he had been a watch queen for them. And he published the results indicating that these deviants, as they were known then, were actually middle-class, married, fairly politically conservative men, religious. And so in many ways, he may have helped change the way that Americans thought about men who had sex with men at this particular time. And so when we think about potential benefits, certainly the destigmatization of homosexuality in society was a big thing at that time. Some police districts indicated that they cut down or stopped doing these kinds of raids to try and arrest and imprison these men in response to the knowledge that these men were sort of just like everybody else, middle class, married men. But a lot of people have criticized this particular research for the potential harms. So obviously there was deception involved in the research. There was clearly a lack of informed consent. So these men did not know that they were participating in research, nor what the nature of the research was. There was also potential for breach of confidentiality, which at that time could mean arrest and imprisonment, although Humphreys always maintained that he kept the records of the names of people and any identifying information in a locked place that was apparently 1,000 miles away from where he lived at the time. There's also potential for distress if men recognized him when he showed up at their homes. Maybe they felt that he was going to out them or try and blackmail them or something. And there was an invasion of privacy in using the police officer to obtain their names and home addresses. So this research has been really widely criticized, although a lot of people have sort of tried to remind folks that there weren't institutional review boards at this time. There wasn't the same level of scrutiny or the same ideas around ethics as there are now. So a lot of people have reminded us to consider the research in the context of the time. Just a little side note, the faculty in his department at Washington University, he was a sociology grad student, when they found out about the research, some of them were all for it and felt like it was totally ethical. He guarded people's confidentiality. Nobody was harmed in the research, and other faculty members were outraged. There was a huge fight. Apparently, there was even a fist fight at some point, and some of the faculty members actually left that department. So within the department, even, it created a lot of controversy about the ethics of this particular study. And so there's been a lot of writing still today about whether or not this sort of violated some of our ethical standards of today, or sort of generally of research. And I think this gives us a nice idea that that the balancing of potential benefits and harms isn't necessarily a completely black and white situation. So Musanski's article, I think, gives you a nice overview of how to work with IRBs to conduct sexuality research, indicating that they may consider sexuality research to be more sensitive than other kinds of research, and I think does a really nice job of talking about approaching the IRB experience as an opportunity to educate your IRB, so reminding them that negative feelings may not equal harm, providing literature demonstrating minimal harm associated with asking participants about sex and sexuality, utilizing the guidelines laid out in ethics guidelines to be able to demonstrate those points to them. And I think Musanski and other folks have also made an important point that we should avoid framing the research as potentially harmful to research participants, even if the IRB asks us to do that. So really trying to balance the IRB's concerns with trying not to be so inflammatory with our research participants. And I'll give you an example of this in a second. And ensure the IRB that you are implementing best practices with regards to questions and procedures, that you are competent, that you have done your homework and your research, and that you are competent in carrying out the research to the sort of best standards and best practices, which is a key piece of doing research ethically anyway. So there are a variety of strategies for minimizing risk of harm and maximizing potential benefits. Your book talks about some of those in terms of strategies to maintain confidentiality, coding your data, using unique identifiers, what have you. I won't go over all of those. Musanski also gives a nice list, and so I'll talk about a few of those, including questions about the participation effects. I think is a really great way of thinking about examining the effects of participation on your participants. Present the research during informed consent in a way that doesn't assume or potentially precipitate a high potential for harm or distress. So for example, some IRBs or some consent forms will ask you to say something like, some of the questions are sensitive in nature and it's possible that you may feel some distress as a result of participation. If you should become distressed as a result of your participation, here's who you should contact, and giving researcher information or counseling centers or what have you. Another way to say that in a way that is sort of less inflammatory may be something like there are no known risks associated with participating in the research, or the risks associated with participating in this research are not more than those encountered in daily life. However, if you become upset and would like to talk to somebody, here's the contact information of a counseling center. So not going into the research telling people, all right, this is really sensitive, I'm going to ask you some really heavy stuff. You might really get upset by this. But giving them a sense that, like, all right, I'm going to ask you some sensitive questions. These are not more crazy questions than you're asked in daily life. If you go to donate blood, for example, you're going to be asked all about your sexual history and practices. But if you become upset by any of these questions and want to get referral to some care, here's who you can contact. Another strategy is utilizing community advisory boards or engaging in community-based participatory research and being able to get feedback from the community from which you're sampling. to get a sense of issues that you might face, of how people might react to the kinds of questions that you're asking, responding appropriately to disclosures of all sorts of things that may come up in sexuality research, and I'll talk about that in just a second a bit more. So responding in ways that are culturally competent, being non-judgmental when people reveal specific behaviors or attitudes to you, balancing confidentiality needs with safety and reporting issues. And again, I'll talk about that in a second a bit more. And so really, all of these strategies highlight the need for really good training for all of the people who are going to be engaged in research. So human subjects training, training in your content areas, making sure that you're not walking into an interview and having somebody tell you something and you freak out or have an obvious reaction to that. Being able to maintain a non-judgmental stance with them and being able to be culturally competent and understand what they're talking about are really important, not just to get good data, but to engage in research in a way that is ethical. Providing referrals is also a really fantastic thing to do no matter what you're asking people about. Being able to collect some resources for them and offer those to them, again, in a way that is not inflammatory, is really key. Publishing the findings accurately and completely, and your book does a nice conversation about that. And translating that research into practice when applicable. And so these are sort of broad strategies in addition to the ones that are outlined in your book and in the Mustancy article for how to minimize risk and maximize potential benefits. So another issue for a lot of us is trying to balance professional and research ethics. So many of you are clinicians, have various kinds of degrees or will have various kinds of degrees like an MSW. And so along with those clinical degrees comes a certain set of professional ethics. So for example, if there are situations of childhood sexual abuse, interpersonal violence, suicidal ideation, are you a mandated reporter? Are there state or local requirements about what you should report? And it's really important to know what those are and to think about how to balance those with the research ethics of maintaining confidentiality and privacy and giving people the autonomy to deal with those situations in the way that they choose to deal with those situations. So a really important thing to do in informed consent is describing to people the limits of confidentiality. In a lot of the research that I have conducted, I have had specific statements in the informed consent to let people know that if they reveal to me that they have actual intent to kill themselves or to kill somebody else, or that the child is a victim of abuse, that I will need to break confidentiality and report that. And often, one of the most common things that I have dealt with is suicidality. And so most of the depression scales, for example, ask people in the last 7 days or in the last week or whatever, have you had thoughts of ending your lives? And so those are usually done on a Likert scale of not at all to every day or a lot or something like that. And so if somebody reports on that scale that they have been thinking every day about ending in their lives, or if in the course of research in some other way they indicate, I've really been thinking about killing myself and I have a plan and maybe this weekend is it. This is the day. As a professional in your field, as a researcher, as a psychologist or a social worker, you may hit a limit of confidentiality there. And so you need to be clear to them ahead of time of what that limit is. If somebody says yeah, I think about it, doesn't everybody think about killing themselves? I would never do it because I would never do that to my mom, or who would take care of my dog, or, if they have legitimate sort of boundaries for why they wouldn't do that, that probably isn't something that we would think about reporting. This would only be in a situation when people, when we believe that they actually have very clear and imminent plans to kill themselves. And we also need to be clear about what our own responsibilities are and what the appropriate regulations are. So are you a mandated reporter? What and when, that should say when, you must report something, and a way around some of this, potentially if we are not mandated reporters and we don't want to break confidentiality, is providing information to participants as to how to report the abuse and get help themselves. But we really have to respect the autonomy for participants to make their own decisions about their lives. So again, this is another area in which this may not be a completely black and white situation about how to handle disclosures of abuse, trauma, particularly abuse or trauma that is ongoing. And we also have to think about situations in which reporting that abuse may actually increase the potential for harm. So put somebody in a situation where they may be homeless or where they may be threatened with additional violence. So we have to think hard about what those decisions are and what our professional and research ethics are and how to balance those. So those are really hard questions to ask, I think. So I won't spend a ton more time on here. I think both readings for this module are really fantastic, but if you have questions, thoughts, things that have come up for you as you've been reading them and thinking about moving forward in your own research career, I'd love to hear those. I think these are really juicy, interesting ideas and conversations. So I'm happy to engage in those if somebody wants to start a particular topic under the general discussion forum. And that would be a great one for those of you who are interested in engaging more in this topic. Thanks.